Thank you to the sponsors of the talk. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to the dean. Thank you to my fellow faculty members in biology, who I think those of you who are here just want to see whether I'm actually on this campus. As Matt mentioned, I do hold another position at Hughes, and we just moved in June, and I want to thank especially the college, the facilities people, and especially Matt and Noah Dowell and Fiona and Ale, who are here in the front second row over here, part of my team. This wouldn't have been possible without a lot of people sacrificing a lot of time and effort to get the lab here from Madison, Wisconsin. So we're now all Maryland voters and doing what we can, all right? Although I'm just going to put in a plug, and I know it's probably totally inappropriate in a public forum, but Wisconsin is now -1 schmuck. So I'm going to put that out. If I'm editorializing, yeah. Well, let me maybe be clear. It was a conscious choice to come to a public university. I'm really proud to join Maryland, and that previously mentioned person did a tremendous amount of damage in 8 years to a great public university. So, and is succeeded now by a former superintendent of schools. So on Wisconsin, get back in the right direction, and a lot of work to be done back there. Anyway, that's not what you came for, but what the heck, you know, if we were having a beer, that's what we'd talk about. Okay. So we're going to get out on the Serengeti in a minute, but I want to give you some context. The context is, as Matt described, I spent a lot of my time fashioning stories for all sorts of different kinds of audiences in different ways. And a few years ago, I was just wrapping up work on a documentary for the Smithsonian Channel with a cheery title called Mass Extinction. And it was in that, making of that film was the first time I had any opportunity to spend a lot of time with ecologists and in different parts of the world. And I learned that even some of the most protected places in the world were showing some significant signs of stress. And like you, I've seen headlines like this, where half of the world's wildlife had disappeared since 1970, and then you see things like this, where there was a serious plan to put a paved road right through the middle of the Serengeti and the wildebeest migration route. And all of these signs made me worry about the fate of the natural world. Now, as I'll tell you in a second, I've made my living indoors as an indoor biologist, but certainly my soul is connected with the outdoors. And this was very concerning, and I thought at a minimum, I wanted to go see some of these places just in case. I also wanted to go see these places to see whether or not there was some hope. And maybe after you nod off in a few minutes, I'll tell you why I'm giving you this talk. I'm giving you this talk because I think it is one of hope. It's one of grounded hope. You're going to see some evidence for that later. And I just think that hope is a fuel that we cannot get enough of these days. So this is why I'm going to give a talk from this angle, and you're not getting any data slides from my lab. That'll be in another setting sometime. So with these possible changes taking place in the Serengeti, I had never been there. Ever since I was a little kid watching TV, et cetera, in black and white TV in Toledo, Ohio, I thought I need to see this place. And I hadn't gotten there. So I thought I better go there. And this time, my children are by now all grown. And I thought, well, I'll take the family, my son Chris, my daughter-in-law Kristen. There I am with my wife Jamie, and my son Will, and my son Patrick. And this is the very fancy eastern entrance gate of Serengeti. You'll see no McDonald's or Denny's anywhere nearby. And here's a view over our vehicle. As it heads into the Serengeti, we're going to be on this gravelly dirt roads for several days. And this is late June, so you can see some of the grass has turned to brown. Now, as we pop the top on the vehicle and start to roll down this road, we're thinking, oh my gosh, here we are entering the iconic Serengeti. And there's a lot of excitement in the car, and people are sort of scanning left and right. And we're driving for a while, not seeing some things. Finally, somebody shouts, and we can see just the back of this lioness coming out of the tall grass. And I'm thinking, I'm in trouble. No one in my family is a biologist. And if this is what wildlife spotting in the Serengeti is going to be like, they're going to leave me by the side of the road. So But we keep on driving, and we start to see some sort of specks of green and then maybe some shimmer of water, and we sort of come up over a rise, and here's what we see. Every direction, stripes. I'd guess probably a couple thousand zebra. They were headed to this water hole, but for 360 all the way around, a ton of zebra. As I look to the west, coming down at us from this watering hole, sort of the dawn patrol coming for a drink. That's what I was looking for. That's the Serengeti I was almost imagining. And really, from that moment on, the Serengeti offered up animals of every size, shape, and color over the next several days, from sturdy little warthogs to lounging hippos to sleek impala and majestic giraffe. I should point out, yeah, I'm like breaking the first rule. You guys don't know who I am, and I'm showing you home movies and pictures from my vacation, right? This is, welcome to Sean's living room. Napping is allowed. But anyway, the giraffe's so phenomenal. Jamie and I decided these were our favorite animals, so we stopped every time we saw a giraffe. That was a lot of stopping. And then occasionally we got really lucky and had some private time with things like this leopard that was, she had stuffed a gazelle up in the tree, and she was just bouncing up and down between munching on the gazelle and taking a little drink down below. We had a little private evening and dawn with her. And so as I gazed across this landscape, I was awestruck. Nothing I had seen on TV, nothing I had read in books, nothing spoiled or really prepared me for the awesome scene of the Serengeti. So many animals. The way this vegetation is, the acacia where the greenery is at the top of the tree, you can see visibility is for hundreds and hundreds of yards in all sorts of directions. So you can sometimes see 6, 8 species easily just by swiveling your head around. Really different from anywhere else that I had been on the planet. But as the days went on, me being the only biologist, sometimes the questions came in the car, Dad, why this or what that? And they discovered that their dad didn't know anything. Their dad had spent too much time in the lab. Because even simple questions like, why are there so many wildebeest, and say relatively few topi, a pretty similar sized grazer, well, I didn't understand. I didn't know anything about why the relative numbers or sizes of different animals on the Serengeti. So I was just, awed by the spectacle, but I really didn't understand what I was looking at. And that's pretty embarrassing because, as Matt described, I have made a living being a biologist, but I didn't understand. I didn't understand what controlled the numbers of these things. I didn't understand anything about their interactions. And I have studied animals my whole life. I've studied somewhat more or less, let's say smaller, if not less charismatic creatures. But I've actually studied how animals get their spots and stripes, so you can sort of understand at least my, spiritual connection to leopards and giraffes. And the one thing I do know from studying what goes on inside these animal bodies, and the same thing goes on in our bodies, is that everything that goes on, and we saw some talks about that just a moment ago, everything inside our bodies is regulated. And what I mean by that is that the concentration, the amount of every substance in the body, every salt, every hormone, every enzyme, et cetera, is maintained within a particular range. Some things in very tiny quantities, some things in very abundant quantities, but they're maintained in those particular ranges. And when those get out of that range, we generally detect that as some sort of disease. The same is true of the cell types in the body, the number of every cell type, red cells, white cells, kidney cells, et cetera. They're maintained in a particularly set range. And certainly when we have too few or too many cells of a given type, that's also manifest as some sort of pathology. And the reason why it's important to appreciate that everything is regulated is just that. For human health, is to understand that the amount of these substances and the number of these sorts of cell types has a lot to do with our normal functioning. And therefore, to understand how life works, this process of regulation is really important. And if you'll allow me a sports analogy, the general strategy that biologists use to understand these sort of rules of regulation, is to identify the key players. In this case, molecules that regulate individual processes. And when we can identify those molecules and understand the rules that govern their play, how they affect some particular process, in the body, then we're empowered with that knowledge to intervene. And that's really the story of molecular biology for the last 50 or 60 years that has catalyzed a revolution in medicine. If you know the key players and you know how they work, well, then you can design things that intervene. And you can design things, for example, that restore missing players or that fix broken links. Perhaps a couple of familiar examples might be in terms of missing players, when the production of insulin is reduced or lost in humans, that's replaced with recombinant insulin for diabetes. So this is the insulin drug here in a vial. And in the case of high cholesterol and the risk of heart disease, knowing the details of the regulation of the proteins that carry cholesterol around the body enabled the design of drugs that reduce that burden. Drugs as a class known as statins. Here's a famous example known as Lipitor. And that regulatory knowledge has empowered us to really reduce the incidence of heart attack and stroke and cardiovascular incidents dramatically since the advent of this drug class. So everything is regulated, certainly from the viewpoint of a molecular biologist, but what I didn't know is whether everything that I was looking at on the Serengeti, is everything out there regulated? Are the numbers of plants and animals regulated? Are there rules that govern life at larger scales? And so after I was on the Serengeti, I went back and I started to dig in what turned out to be a pretty large literature, not just about the Serengeti, but some other places. And if the answer to this question was no, we'd be done. But it turns out the answer is there are rules that govern life at larger scales. And that prompted me to write a book about this called the Serengeti Rules. But in the first half of the book, I actually tell the stories of some of those biomedical pioneers that sort of worked out the rules inside the body and used those to sort of hold them up as a mirror to what ecologists have discovered about the regulation of life at larger scales. And then by analogy to medicine, I asked the question, can we use knowledge of these rules to preserve or even cure ailing ecosystems? And that's what I want to turn to in the last, say, 10 minutes or so of the talk. So I thought before I get into some of that depth, you might appreciate a little bit of the history of the Serengeti. For the first half of the 20th century, the Serengeti really was not a tourist destination. Partly the world was preoccupied with 2 world wars, but it was also really hard to get to, and there are certain diseases like things carried by tsetse flies and all that discouraged visitors. But by the 1950s, folks started coming to the Serengeti, in particular scientists, biologists, naturalists. And they encountered the scene that I encountered 6 decades later. And the first thing that biologists do when they encounter large numbers of things is they want to know, well, just how many exactly are there? And so the first order of business for these biologists was to start counting. And so the first count of the animals in the Serengeti was undertaken in 1958 by 2 German zoologists, Bernard and Michael Jimmick. And this is a little clip from a film they made, produced in 1959, of their strategy for doing the counts. There's Bernard and Michael, and they're going to climb into their rather nattily painted plane, along with a couple other spotters. They've got their clipboards, and they've got a strategy for counting the animals on the Serengeti, because they've got sort of a grid that they're going to fly along. And now, these are graphics, circa 1959. This movie actually won the Academy Award for documentary. And they're going to fly back and forth across the Serengeti, counting the animals. So here you go. Are you ready to go? Let's count the animals on the Serengeti. You ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Yes, this is so-called flying low and slow on the Serengeti. 100 to 300 feet up, 120 miles an hour with a clipboard, counting animals that you may notice are not standing still. Okay? But what they're trying to do is count every animal that's large enough to be seen from the air. And they're going to do this over a 2-week period. And yes, you could also figure out the animals just might move overnight. But that's what they did for a couple of weeks. And they tallied up the total number of animals in the Serengeti. And here are the numbers from their survey. 99,481 wildebeest, okay? Not 482, not 480, 481, okay? And with similar Teutonic precision, 57,199 zebra, 5,172 topi, et cetera, 1,800 or so buffalo, 60 elephants, et cetera. All in all, 367,000 large mammals. And they allowed that maybe they might have missed 10,000 around the edges or from movements or things like that. But they said, roughly 367,000. They were stunned. No herds like this anywhere in the world. And they were also worried. They worried aloud. They said, were there enough plains, mountains, river valleys, and bush areas to maintain the last giant herds still in existence? Well, the answer to this question was actually forthcoming, but it wasn't the answer they expected or worried about. And that answer began to materialize when a young undergraduate named Tony Sinclair arrived in the Serengeti in 1965. Now, Tony had gone there to study birds, but the first thing they did was put him up on a plane as a spotter and have him start counting animals. And in the course of that summer, a little mystery emerged that Tony was part of. And that mystery had to do with the count of buffalo in the Serengeti. And there was a survey taken in 1961 that counted 16,000 buffalo, but in Tony's survey, that number had climbed to 37,000. Now, in general in the world, that was not the direction that herds were going. And they said, well, goodness, we need to know what's going on. And they said to Tony, who over the course of the summer fell in love with the Serengeti and was determined to do his graduate work in the Serengeti, they said, would a birdman study buffalo? Could you study buffalo? And Tony said, I'll study anything. And so he went back to the Serengeti and earned his PhD while doing some very pioneering studies. And I'm happy to say that Tony, 52 years later, is still in the Serengeti. 53 years later. Time flies. And what Tony, over about the first 12 years, did, focusing on the buffalo, is he asked a few questions. The first question was, this mystery he needed to get to do his thesis on was, why were the buffalo increasing? He wanted to understand what explained the great differences in the numbers of different kinds of animals. And really, in his soul, what he wanted to understand was, why is the Serengeti the way it is? So he first attacks this buffalo question, and this is Tony actually studying a buffalo that is tranquilized. This is not, if Tony had studied buffalo this way, we wouldn't be talking about Tony today, but anyway. And the first question, of course, was, was that count an anomaly? Were the buffalo actually increasing? And he was able to confirm the population was growing over the next several years. It kept growing, 54,000, 58,000, et cetera. So it was definitely growing. It was not a mistake in counting some kind of error. But why were the buffalo increasing? Now, here's the audience participation part of this program. Professional ecologists have to recuse themselves, although it doesn't seem like anybody recuses themselves in time these days. All right, I'm going to make those jokes. All right. Professional ecologists also have to excuse me because I'm talking about their field, and I quite clearly don't know anything. But I let you onto that, didn't I? Anyway, so other than the professional ecologists in the room, you can all play along, which is the buffalo population was growing. So let's come up with, Tony had to come up with some hypotheses to test why might the buffalo population be growing. Shout it out. Especially, let's just say students. Let's let any student shout this out. Come on, Maryland. Louder? Fewer predators. Good call. That's a good hypothesis. Any others? Increased resources like what? Grass, because they eat grass, right? Okay, you're 2 for 2, Maryland. Thank God, I'm proud of you, all right? So, more food? Well, from those aerial surveys, they could look at all the forage that was available in the Serengeti. They could look at how much of the plains were occupied by grass. They could measure grass height, et cetera. It turns out, no, there's pretty much a pretty constant amount of food since the 1960s. So I thought, well, that's not it. And you said fewer predators, right? Well, that makes sense. Well, 2 things. Tony actually looked at the causes of death from buffalo, and he realized that actually a relatively small percentage of buffalo died from predators. So that was one data point, but it also, other scientists working in the Serengeti realized that the number of predators was actually going up, that the lion counts were going up during this period. So there are actually more predators in the Serengeti. So that data didn't fit together. So we need a third hypothesis. Anything, can you imagine why would the buffalo be thriving at this time? Or just think about other causes of death. Universal health care. You're catching the subtext of this talk. I really appreciate that. It's on everybody's minds. But you're actually in the right area. What else? For diseases, right, thank you. 3 for 3, 4 for 4, really. So Tony thought, well, the other reason the buffalo population might be growing is, less mortality. And what else would cause mortality is disease. Now, there's lots of diseases that buffalo get and that Tony knew about, but he knew that one disease was particularly notorious. And that disease was called rinderpest or cattle plague. Now, it was understood from the history of the Serengeti that this came into East Africa about 1889 with domesticated cattle from India, and that every few years there was an outbreak, and it hit cattle, and that as well as buffalo, and one other species, wildebeest. And it was thought that, in fact, wildlife were the reservoir, and that every now and then, every actually few years, there would be these, horrible scenes of where the pastoral people around the Serengeti, as well as any cattle ranches, were decimated by this disease. And Tony knew, however, that a new heat-stable vaccine had been introduced right around 1960, and there was a vaccination program going on in the domestic herds. And he thought, aha, maybe that vaccination is having a spillover benefit on the buffalo. And to test that hypothesis, he thought, well, how would he be able to tell whether or not rinderpest is maybe disappearing from the Serengeti because of vaccination? And well, buffalo, just like you and I, when exposed to a virus, make antibodies to that virus. So he thought, well, if I look at blood samples from older and younger buffalo and look for antibodies to rinderpest, maybe I can see what's going on in the Serengeti. And that's what he did, and he saw that while older buffalo had a very high, if not uniform, exposure to rinderpest, younger buffalo, those born since 1964, showed no signs of exposure to the virus. So this is his first eureka moment. He has a pretty darn good idea of why the buffalo numbers are booming. Now, he knows that one other wild species is affected by this virus, that's wildebeest, and so he starts paying closer attention to wildebeest. And he starts participating in the wildebeest counts. And as the wildebeest counts are going on, something rather remarkable emerges. Here are the counts from up through 1977 of wildebeest. Yeah, see, I heard that. I could hear the wows up here. It's all, you got a room full of biologists. It's perfect. You can let it out. You can let it out if you're feeling wowed. Remember, the Jimmics weren't sure that the Serengeti could support 360,000 animals. Wildebeest alone were up to 1.4 million. Okay, so Tony realized that the wildebeest were booming as well, if not more dramatically than the buffalo. Did the same experiment in wildebeest with age-matched blood samples and discovered that no wildebeest born after 1963 showed exposure to rinderpest. So that incredible Serengeti that he landed in 1965 that awed him was actually was a suppressed system, that rinderpest had knocked down numbers, and that before his very eyes, the numbers of buffalo and wildebeest were growing. So he had his explanation. Rinderpest was it. But as he compared notes with other biologists working in the Serengeti, they had noticed some other changes in the Serengeti taking place over this time. I'm going to mention just three, and then we're going to try to connect the dots. So the first thing is fire is an annual phenomenon in the Serengeti. And when you looked at the percent of area in the Serengeti burned in the early 60s versus the early 70s, it was a pretty dramatic reduction in the frequency of fires and in the intensity of those fires. So a lot less of the Serengeti burning and burning less intensely. Other biologists studying other species noticed, for example, that over the same time period, there was an increase in the numbers of giraffes. And who doesn't want more giraffes, right? And then Tony was documenting other changes on the landscape. A little hard to see in these photos, and it takes a while to sort of see the full bloom of this. But he watched this for decades and confirmed it. And that had to do with the number of trees. Unfortunately, this picture series starts on a shady day. But in the foreground here is pretty sparse acacia. But he could tell there's a fair amount of young trees. And this area starts to fill in over time such that by this decade, this is an acacia forest. So fewer and less intense fires and more giraffes and more trees. Can we put all this together? Can we connect all those dots? And that's what Tony and his colleagues did. They realized that when the rinderpest was eradicated, that allows the number of grazers to increase. And as the number of grazers increase, what do they eat? Grass. So if you have less grass, what's that going to do to fires? Going to suppress them, right? Because you have less and shorter grass. They mow that grass down from about 30 centimeters down to about 10 centimeters. And what do you think those fires have to do with tree growth? That's right. The fires with less and shorter grass, you have fewer fires. With fewer fires, it means the young trees get to grow. The forests start filling in. And when you've got more trees, you got more food for things like giraffes and elephants. You also have more nesting sites for birds. You have more cover for predators. And out on the short grass plains, you actually have better habitat for butterflies. You have a greater diversity of wildflowers. It's pretty much a story of more, more, more. So over this, say, decade and a half, Tony realized that the booming wildebeest, making this 600-mile trek around the Serengeti, were sort of grooming the landscape and affecting all these other phenomena. So, we've all seen the films on cable TV, right? That if you see a film about the African savanna, it's only going to take 90 seconds before you see a cat take down, right, a grazer. But if you ask Tony what makes the Serengeti the way it is, his answer would be 1 million lawnmowers. That it's just this humble act of these million animals munching grass as they make their way around the Serengeti that sculpts that landscape for so many other creatures. And I have to confess something about the wildebeest, which is, in searching for pictures of the wildebeest for talks like this, I asked my family, who took almost none, because they're ubiquitous, and it's a matter of taste, but relative to zebra and giraffes, et cetera, but this is the hero of the Serengeti. This is the animal that makes it happen. And that brings me to my first Serengeti rule. Now, I'm going to mention 4 of these rules, and I refer to them as the Serengeti rules because all of these are phenomena, or general rules that you can see in action out on the Serengeti. But, as I'll tell you in a second, they weren't first discovered on the Serengeti. You can just see them there most easily with these sorts of animals. So Serengeti rule number 1 is that some animals are more equal than others. And ecologists refer to these as keystone species, which regulate community diversity. So the presence of the wildebeest in their large numbers has a big influence on the diversity of the ecosystem in which they live. That idea didn't come from the Serengeti, didn't even come from work on land. It came from pioneering ecologist Bob Payne, working in the rocky intertidal systems on the Pacific West Coast and working on this particular predator in that system, the starfish. And Bob discovered that without this starfish, these communities collapsed. And it reminded him of the keystone in a Roman arch, animated here in an animation I stole off the web and cannot find out how to slow down. But the idea is that when that keystone is removed, the arch collapses. And that's where he came up with the concept of the keystone. We also owe Bob for coining another term widely used to describe this phenomenon, this sort of chain reaction or cascade of interactions through the food chain of these sorts of creatures at different levels and different positions in the food web. And he described this as a trophic cascade. And that brings me right away to my second Serengeti rule, 2 out of 4. We're getting closer to the finish line. And trophic cascade is really what that's describing is that some species have these really strong indirect effects on other species mediated through trophic interactions. So things that are not directly involved with that creature can have a really strong indirect effect. For example, the wildebeest effect on trees and giraffes is a strong indirect effect. It's rippling through this system in a cascade-like effect. So 2 rules. Trophic cascades were, again, discovered elsewhere, but again, you can see them in action in the Serengeti. To get to the 3rd rule, I want to return to the discussion of the wildebeest. You may have been wondering, as you saw those number of wildebeest climbing, where are they today, or what happened in the ensuing decades? Obviously, if they kept growing at that rate, basically East Africa would be covered with wildebeest about 10 deep. So that couldn't happen. And it turns out that 1.4 million was their maximum. And I just want you to begin thinking about this question about, so an animal population is booming. What's going to make that level off? What's going to eventually constrain it? It was a really important issue for Tony, because when he reported this to colleagues, other colleagues working in African parks urged him to start culling wildebeest, thinking that they would overrun and destroy the system, and that he was actually letting one of the iconic wildernesses on the planet destroy itself and would collapse. But Tony thought, why would humans need to intervene? These systems have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. There must be some natural mechanisms to control the growth of these herds. And so he stuck to his guns, or in this case, didn't pick up a gun. And lo and behold, in the ensuing years, the number of wildebeest leveled off at around 1 million. Okay, and that's about where they stand today. So what controlled the wildebeest? What eventually made the wildebeest, put the wildebeest in check? So let's think about sort of the formal possibilities. Obviously, wildebeest, they eat food, and they're eaten in turn by predators. And the question would be, are they really controlled in sort of shorthand, ecological shorthand, from the top down in the food chain or from the bottom up by the amount of food? And before I tell you what Tony and his colleagues, especially Simon and Endowed, discovered, let me tell you what Tony and other collaborators figured out about the regulation of other mammals in the Serengeti. So in general, you can imagine this is true for any mammal, that they could be regulated by predation or by food supply. And this little graph, which comes from a paper by, well, is constructed from a paper by Tony and Simon Mduma and Justin Brashear some time ago. They looked at the mortality rate due to predation of a whole bunch of Serengeti mammals. So to understand this graph, which I'm just going to admit is like one of my most favorite graphs I've ever seen in the scientific literature. I love this. I think you can understand the Serengeti if you understand this graph. It's not too hard to understand. Let's start up here in the upper left. Let's look at things like the oribi, about a 20-kilogram mammal, reasonably plentiful in the Serengeti. Essentially 100% mortality due to predation. You have to wonder kind of what oribi parents tell their kids when they're growing up, right? Someday, your dinner. And at that size, there's about 10 predators in the Serengeti that can take oribi. Not just the cats, but the jackals, large raptors, large snakes, et cetera. There's lots of opportunity. So you get a little bit bigger, still Impala and Topi. Again, high level of predation. And then drops off here, but before we understand sort of the middle, let's move over here to the right and see essentially for elephants, zip. Hippos, zip. Rhinoceros, zip. I mean, it may happen to one youngster, but it basically statistically insignificant effective predation on these animals. So let's think about this. What's going on here? Of course, these are relatively small mammals. These are relatively very large. And what you're looking at here is two lifestyles in the Serengeti. And for old movie fans, I describe this. This is the James Dean, live fast, die young lifestyle. And this is the Marlon Brando, all-you-can-eat lifestyle, right? Because these animals get really large. And at that size, they are too large to be taken down by any predators in the Serengeti. So obviously, you're looking at long gestation periods, a long period of time to reproductive maturity, et cetera, the need for lots of resources, but essentially impervious to predation. Over here, fast life cycle, fast sexual maturity, frequent reproduction, and they're in a race with the predators. Well, some other animals are in between. Giraffe, essentially insignificant predation. Buffalo, about 25%. Zebra, a bit higher. It's about 150 kilogram cutoff. Where do the wildebeest fall in here? And these animals, of course, are being regulated by food supply. That's basically what's determining just how dense they can become on the Serengeti. These by predation. Well, after a detailed study, it's clear that it's food supply that's regulating the abundance of the wildebeest. And that's really a function of their density. How does this work? And I just want you to picture this. If you're a molecular biologist, think of feedback regulation. If you're an ecologist, I apologize for the explanation that's about to come. But when animals are at low density, okay, that means there's a lot of food per capita. And so the growth rate is high. But as you get to a certain density on the Serengeti, and particularly as you get in season where food is not so plentiful, the dry season, that becomes a limiting factor, and that is going to dampen the growth of the population. So at higher densities, at large numbers, growth declines, or in fact can turn negative. The population can shrink when food is limiting. And Tony observed firsthand in a couple really bad drought years, mortality that was up to 30% of the whole wildebeest herd. So food is regulating the density of wildebeest, elephants, hippos, giraffes, as a matter of the per capita available food, so density-dependent regulation. And this brings us already to Serengeti Rule number 3. And that is the regulation of some species, in fact, lots of species, depends upon their density. Again, not discovered for the first time on the Serengeti. You can just see it in action. So why did I tell you about these 3 rules on the Serengeti? Why did I go this far? And that's because every place is the Serengeti. Everywhere where you have this sort of structure, where you have plants producing the food, some grazers that eat the plants, and some predators around that eat the grazers, you have the potential for these keystone species, these trophic cascades, and this density-dependent regulation of populations. And if those are general rules, then by the analogy I gave you at the front of the talk, if we're going to intervene in ecosystems, we need to know the rules of these regulation. We need to be able to identify the key players, those species that regulate community structure, those that are more important than others to community structure. We need to figure out the rules that govern their play, their interaction with other species, and then we can contemplate the possibility of replacing what is missing or fixing broken links in the ecosystem. So in the last few minutes of this talk, I want to give you some examples of intervening in 2 big ecosystems to try to fix what's ailing them. And I'm going to start with a place that should be reasonably familiar to you, often referred to as the American Serengeti, and that's Yellowstone National Park. And Yellowstone's known for lots of things, but for botanists, they know, for example, that it's known for its populations of the iconic Western American tree, the aspen. And the study of these trees by the 1990s revealed that something bizarre was going on with the aspen. And that was that they seemed really old, really essentially senescent. If you looked through aging, determining the ages of aspen groves all over Yellowstone, you realize that while there was sort of a distribution of age classes reaching all the way back to the early 19th century, the more recent age classes were missing. So the trees were very old. And you can sort of see that that decline is, well, certainly it's pretty bad starting in the 1920s or so. And for those studying Yellowstone, a possible culprit for this was fairly obvious. This is Bill Ripple from Oregon State University standing in a field. And if you look around him in Aspen Grove, you can see that something's been munching on the aspen. And at that height, the culprit would be elk. And elk population is pretty considerable in Yellowstone. So why might this be? Why might there be so many elk that they're actually suppressing the growth of the aspen? Well, let's think about it in terms of one of these simple food chains. You might say, well, if the elk are suppressing the aspen, maybe something's missing. Students only now, what's missing? Predators, anything in particular? There you go. Wolves. And we know the history of wolves in Yellowstone, well documented. We know the history of wolves really across North America, which was they were deliberately exterminated. And the last wolf was killed in Yellowstone in about 1924, which is an uncanny correlation with essentially where you start to see the decline in aspen populations. So it was about a 2-decade-long debate, public debate about whether wolves should be put back into Yellowstone. Of course, there's a lot of cultural concern about wolves in terms of effect on livestock and things like that. But it was known from the fossil record that one could see in, for example, Yellowstone caves. That was the only mammal missing from Yellowstone. Everything else was there. So after 2 decades, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone. About 1995, this is the first wolf being brought in. And think about this, especially for the students, think about this for a little bit. Wolves have been missing from Yellowstone for 70 years. What could biologists reasonably predict? If you have something missing from an ecosystem for 70 years, will anything happen when you put that animal back in? Well, as it turns out, some things happened. Well, first of all, the wolf population kind of took hold after introduction and oscillated around, various hard winters and things like that in aspen, and some of them emigrated out of the main study area. But the number of elk kind of steadily declined to about 1/3 of their current numbers. But as you looked around at other things in Yellowstone, there were some other changes taking place. If you looked at the aspen, for example, you could see that the indicators of browsing decreased over the first 10 to 20 years of this reintroduction. Aspen heights, the average aspen heights were increasing in various parts of the park. And if you looked at some other plant populations. Here's a picture in Yellowstone from the same vantage point before wolf reintroduction and after wolf reintroduction. And what you see growing in the foreground here are willow, and willow are the favorite building materials and food of, you can all read it, beaver. And if you look at what happened to the number of beaver colonies in parts of the park, you saw the beavers come back in and be able to establish themselves. So there were a bunch of changes that happened in Yellowstone. There's some complications to the overall story, but in general, the wolves had an impact, and that impact rippled through all the way to the vegetation, including cottonwoods and things like that, and that ripple effect had impacts on streams and on erosions of stream banks and temperatures in the river and what trout experienced and things like this, a whole bunch of effects. So basically, the reintroduction of wolves induced a trophic cascade, even after their absence after 70 years. And that was maybe one of the first sort of deliberate introductions that gave us a hint of Serengeti Rule number 4. And I think it's the most important rule to maybe share with all the non-scientists that we know. And that is that nature is resilient. That given a chance, in this case habitat, protection, and time, populations can rebound, and they can rebound dramatically. Now this ripple effect of the wolf was pretty phenomenal, but we've known this from protecting species in other circumstances. Let me just show you some data of what's happened when species have come under deliberate protections historically. This is a northern elephant seal, protected beginning in the 1920s, rebounded from a low of perhaps 20 animals to 200,000 today. Sea otter, almost exterminated along the Pacific Rim, down to perhaps as few as 1,000 animals in 1911 due to the fur trade, now well over 100,000 animals. You can see this northern Pacific humpback, about a 12-fold recovery in about 40 years. Bald eagle, you know its story, 20-fold recovery in 50 years. And the wolf, which was at 0 because it had, there were none, but it was reintroduced, and then in the greater Yellowstone area, there's now a large number of wolves. So given that protection, if the habitat's still there and given some time, it's pretty remarkable. You can tell the same story about grizzly bears. You can tell the same story about manatees in Florida. There are more stories. So individual species can rebound if given the chance. But you might ask, but aren't things worse in some places? Yes, they are. And it might be a lot tougher for systems to recover if more than one species is missing, but that doesn't stop some people from trying. And so I'm going to wind up tonight telling you the story of a place in Southeast Africa, in the country of Mozambique, called Gorongosa. Now, Gorongosa is in essentially the geographic center of the country. Mozambique is a large country on the southeastern part of Africa, twice the area of the state of California. Big country, lots of natural areas, big ocean coast. And Gorongosa was, in the 1960s, one of the jewels of Southern Africa, and a destination for lots of Hollywood jet setters like John Wayne and all this sort of stuff. And I'll show you a clip from that time. Here's a clip from Gorongosa in 1963. Just sort of imagine the music for this, especially with the VW bugs going in. And the people are driving around, and they're looking at, you can see the lions are so well fed, they're just goofing around near the wildebeest, okay? In fact, the lion was the symbol of Gorongosa. Now, you may hear me using the past tense, and the reason I'm using the past tense is after Mozambique gained its independence from Portugal in the mid-1970s, a horrible civil war broke out, one of the worst civil wars in recent memory. 5 million people were displaced, 1 million people were killed, and Gorongosa was about the geographic center of the conflict because it wound up being essentially the headquarters of the rebel army. And this is footage from that time. So you can see here's a firefight going on in Gorongosa. You might catch a glimpse of a building in one of these shots. There's a picture of a building. And these fights went on over an 18-year period. So Gorongosa had been well studied by some biologists before the war. So after the war, after the truce was signed, they came back after the war to see what was there. And this is what they found. They found, of course, all the park vehicles shot to pieces, all the buildings bombed out. And then they took a wildlife survey. And here are the numbers. Okay, blue bars are before the war, orange bars are after the war. Before the war, 14,000 buffalo. After the war, 50. Before the war, 2,500 elephants. After the war, about 100. Before the war, 3,500 hippo. About 50 after the war. You get the whole picture. Decimation. Almost complete annihilation. In fact, they couldn't find a lion. It said if you drove around Gorongosa in the year 2000, it might take 5 or 6 hours before you saw a baboon or a warthog, let alone something larger than that. And that's really the way Gorongosa would still be today, were it not for the the bold move of an American philanthropist named Greg Carr. Now, Greg Carr had done well in the telecom industry in the 1990s, doing something called voicemail, whatever that is. And he was really interested after that in using his business skills, and he had interest in conservation, and thought he was looking for where he could put those skills to work and marry human development with conservation. And he learned the story of Mozambique, and he learned the story of Gorongosa, and he realized that Mozambique was the only country in southern and eastern Africa that didn't have a tourism industry because the Civil War had wiped that out. And he thought, well, if we can bring Gorongosa back, then we can bring tourism back, we can bring jobs back. It's a win-win situation. So Greg signed an agreement with the Mozambique government, a public-private partnership where he would be the philanthropist and they would be the public side of it, to try to restore Gorongosa. Now, this was signed in 2004. People told him, Mozambicans told him, he's nuts. They said, literally, there's nothing there. It's hopeless. He went in with a bunch of engineers and biologists, slept in the back of a truck, got malaria 3 times. But he stuck with it. And in 2015, a year after I was in the Serengeti, Greg's invitation, I went to Gorongosa. And I'm going to give you, again, this is almost your last bit of handheld footage, but Gorongosa is a different layout. At the center of Gorongosa is a big lake that swells in the wet season and shrinks back a bit in the dry season. And that process leaves a very rich silt that nourishes vegetation and kind of creates a salad bowl for wildlife. And we're going to fly over that lake and sort of the edge of the salad bowl and see what's going on in 2015. I can't do anything about that helicopter noise. This is out the window of a helicopter. You can see that part of the helicopter. So if you look down, you can see some animals bouncing around the salad bowl. You can see their trails. Those are water buck. You might see some birds flying in a second. All these little rivulets lead into and out of that main lake. And then we're going to fly over a little larger piece of a river and look down in that river. See if anybody can anyone identify these animals, maybe in the front row? Can you tell what they are? Hippos, exactly. That is a whole lot of hippo, okay? And if you have not been to Africa and you go, that's a good distance to be from that many hippos, because the smell is unbelievable, I gotta tell you that. But they are amazing animals. And you can see some, that's a big hippo party, but some are leaving the party and swimming away. Now we're gonna set the helicopter down at a water hole a little bit more in the forest. And now we see a little troop of elephants. Look at the youngsters. Look at the numbers of youngsters in these families, okay? So this is 11 years into the restoration project. And one of the things Greg did in setting this up is that he set up a scientific research center as he was setting up the whole rest of it, and invited essentially the world's biologists to come study Gorongosa and help him manage this project. And I happened to be there when the results of the 2014 wildlife survey were reported. So the question is, how did large animal populations change in that time? Well, in 2000, there were fewer than 1,000 large mammals of all types combined. And in 2014, there were 71,000. You can even smile if you like. I can't tell with the blinding lights coming out of the back of the room, but if you're a biologist, this is what gave me hope. This is what gave me hope. This place was given up for dead, but there was enough remnant populations, there's certainly the habitat there, that given protection, and that was one of the first things Greg did, it's a ranger force of 120 people. It stopped any further poaching. Well, controls further poaching, is virtually poaching every day. But the animals have been booming back. Elephant populations are back to about 600. Hippos to about the same number. Lions are to about 66. He really didn't introduce many animals from anywhere else. This is either the rebound of animals that were already there, or some immigration coming in from some surrounding wild areas around Gorongosa. Now, the proportions of animals, though, are totally different than they were from before the war, because these populations have started from different residual numbers. And for example, there's nowhere near the number of predators. Perhaps there's only about 66 lions, and there used to be 500. And that's a concern in terms of controlling the grazer populations. And I would have told you that there's no other large predators. No hyenas, no wild dogs, no leopards, except for just one day I got this email from Greg. And there's the first leopard seen in Gorongosa National Park in 40 years. They're immigrating in from the outskirts. There's obviously some food supply there. And within days, 3 more members of what was perhaps a a family were spotted. Wild dogs have been deliberately reintroduced this year in 2018. And the story of Gorongosa is going so much better than anyone expected, and is such a matter of national pride, and is fueling so many other things. Greg's commitment to human development, the philanthropy has spent more money outside the park than in, and it spent that money on health care for the surrounding community of about 200,000 people, building schools, farming programs, girls clubs, family planning, et cetera. So very integrated conservation and human development, now I think considered one of the models for the world. It's gone well enough that the vision for Gorongosa has changed from protecting this park, which is pretty big, to establishing a conservation area that's about 8 times the size, includes Mount Gorongosa, but includes a mixed-use area. There's a couple 100,000 people living in this area. Some hunting concessions have already converted to national park voluntarily, and the idea is that the park and this conservation area will extend all the way to the Indian Ocean and the Zambezi River. And that 8-fold expansion will create a conservation area the same size as Serengeti and Ngorongoro in Tanzania, about 30,000 square kilometers, with the carrying capacity, it's thought, for as many as 10,000 elephants and about 500 lions. That's what the government of Mozambique's committed to, and Greg has just signed a 30-year extension of his partnership with Mozambique. And if you allow me this, because this is my day job, part of my day job, just about 20 minutes away, I'm happy to say that I was able to persuade the Hughes trustees that this was going well enough that we should try to pitch in. And so Hughes is actually supporting science education at Gorongosa. This is me a couple years ago when Mateus Matumba, who was park warden at the time and is now the minister in charge of all protected areas in Gorongosa. That was the US ambassador to Mozambique at the time, Doug Griffiths. There's Greg Carr. And our commitment has led to the establishment of the first master's program, first master's in biology program in a national park anywhere. These are the first class of students, 12 Mozambican students. The plan is, and the necessity is, of course, this park belongs to Mozambique. And as soon as possible, train as much as the Mozambican workforce as possible, and have them not only take over Gorongosa, but all of the protected areas in the country. And so, in 15 or 20 years, I hope that this is still a story that we're talking about and pointing to as a new model for conservation. But you may be wondering about the Serengeti itself. Remember, I told you about that road, but I can tell you that on pretty good authority, namely these 3 giraffes, I can tell you that all the roads in the Serengeti remain unpaved, and goodness, let's keep it that way. Thanks for listening. Those of you that have lives may want to run. Those of you that have questions, there's a mic there, or you can just shout it out and I'll repeat it to the crowd. Questions or comments? Sure.
How do you feel about this movement to try to take extinct species, pull their genomes out, and bring them back?
How do I feel about bringing back extinct species, using molecular genetics? I sort of feel that we should explore it. I think that we need moonshots sometimes to catalyze a lot of creativity. You want to do this in an ecologically responsible way. But I can think back that when I was a student, there was a lot of debate about the Human Genome Project and $3 billion to get a genome, and gee, couldn't we spend that money doing a lot of other things? But I do think that cloning a mammoth or whatever inspires so much imagination and so much creativity that, and I think that we're a society that can afford those things. How many mammoths we should put out there in the world is something that should be debated. But should we try? I think we should try, yeah. Even if it's not even important to bring back the mammoth. It may be important to see just how far we can push the technology. The passenger pigeon, the thylacine, I'd make a nice vote for the thylacine. I think we can afford these things as long as we're investing in everything else. And speaking of affording, if I can just insert something here about Gorongosa, I was shocked to learn the cost of this program. All the farming, healthcare, education programs, and the science, and the rangers, the whole Gorongosa project, $6 million a year. How can we afford not to do these things, right? And I think this is a place where philanthropy could make a huge impact, especially philanthropy on the scale that resources exist in this country. And so I know some argument for not messing around with molecular genetics of mammoths might be, gee, couldn't we spend our money elsewhere? Yeah, we can, but actually there's plenty of money to do all this stuff. It's just a matter of setting those priorities. And I'm in favor that we should do it. And I think there's some philanthropists, and you may have just seen like 10 days ago in the New York Times, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, a Swiss philanthropist named Visa just made a $1 billion commitment to large-scale landscape conservation like Gorongosa over the next 10 years, $100 million a year. That is going to go a long way when you can do Gorongosa projects at $6 million per. So, but there's plenty of more room for plenty of more billions to be deployed wisely. Sorry, you were asking a question, yeah.
No, that's fine. Quick question. Obviously, land-based ecological systems are pretty well studied, and being able to put organisms back in, like the wolves in Yellowstone, has worked really well. I want to know if you could comment at all on marine ecosystems. Obviously, there's some major challenges going on, and a lot is known, of course, about global warming and coral reef ecology and the acidification of reefs and substrates, things like that. I know there's a lot more challenges that are posed as far as protecting those areas when there's such movement between those, and I just wanted to hear if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, what I know I pick up from people that I interview, talk to, et cetera, bring together for various meetings. So a couple things, just ocean in general. I'm going to start with the good news. The good news is in terms of fish populations, like commercially significant fish populations, we have lots of experience in our Atlantic and Pacific fisheries of populations that were overfished to some critical level, and once the pressure was taken off, even in 3 to 5 years, those fisheries might have been reopened. So one great thing about the ocean is that fish can make a huge number of eggs, and if you lay off them, those populations can come roaring back much faster than 2 at a time elephants, okay? Or 1 at a time elephants, I should say. It takes 2 to mate. I'm going back to my biology class. Don't let me teach at this school. What a Catholic education does to you, you don't even know. You have to discover it later. So that's sort of one of the good news. We have a lot of experience with things rebounding, and you mentioned the coral reefs, and no doubt these, crucial nurseries of the sea. They're also, often in international waters where, it's a bit of a, it's almost like the old days of pirates, right? So marine fisheries experts that I know are particularly concerned about what's going on in international waters. But we do know that people are trying to cultivate and engineer corals that are more heat resistant. Where will that go? Can we do that fast enough? Will they be diverse enough? Can they really rebuild these communities? It's a race, right? Because the prognosis is grim over the next 3 decades. What further destruction is going to happen to coral reefs? And so can we engineer our way out of it? Because we're probably not going to see any reversal of the acidification or warming of the world's oceans over that time, right? We're not going to do anything in the next decade. Well, never mind. We're not going to do anything in the next decade. We're not going to catch up. So we're really talking about what are things going to look like, in 30 years, and can we do any engineering to offset that? We got to protect what's left, zealously. I'll add one more, just gratuitous editorial, but I just learned it like 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I've just been repeating it everywhere I went. I was at a meeting in New York. This is a whole bunch of conservation groups have coalesced around Ed Wilson's half-Earth idea to talk about protection strategies. And at least on land, forgive me with the statistics, I wasn't writing fast enough, but this was roughly true. I like this. Roughly true. About 5% of the world's populations are indigenous populations. They're living on the lands that their ancestors lived on, and recognized essentially, by the UN and others as indigenous people. That's about 25% of protected lands, though, by the way. That contains about 70% of all terrestrial biodiversity. So a really important strategy is the protection of indigenous people's rights, which of course are threatened everywhere, in Brazil acutely right now. But I had no idea that basically that political and civil rights battle will have huge consequences for biodiversity. And I think rightly, some folks are really focusing on, legislation and UN treaties and things like that to protect the rights of indigenous people. So part of that is just to say it's going to take a lot of different things at a lot of different scales. Personally, if you hook me up to a lie detector, I would say I think it's going to be a patchy result. Some places are going to disappear. They're going to break our hearts. But some other places like Gorongosa have a shot at really roaring back and reestablishing pretty big areas. So, but it's never too soon to get started. Other comments or questions? Yeah. There's no such thing as a lower animal. That's the fruit. It goes fruit fly, mouse, chicken, frog, C. elegans. Okay, so we're reptile fans. News is not good for reptiles, amphibians, birds, insects. Flying insects, you may know. Biomass of flying insects has probably been reduced 60 or 70% from surveys taken in Europe and North America. People trying to figure out why that is. So, yeah, there's the loss in both numbers and diversity is very worrisome, and so that's why protecting habitats and corridors and food sources and all this sort of stuff is going to be so important. And invasives are a concern, and outbreaks of diseases like chytrid fungus is a concern. There's a lot of stuff to get on, to work on, which is why just if there's still any ecologists left who will talk to me, or not, really I come from the biomedical world. Okay, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, one of the largest endowed philanthropies in the United States. And I have I have a sense of how much money we spend on biomedical research, and I don't mean to diss any of that, but the underfunding of ecology is a disgrace. And we, my God, relative to what that's going to have to do with the quality of life in the future, we have to do it. So part of my appeal that's in Serengeti Rules and in other sort of places is especially for the whole biological community to wake up and realize that as much as we treasure our biomedical research funding, that if we don't fund biology with a big B, there won't be much of a world worth studying, 30 or 40 years from now. So thank you for that. Let me get that sermon out. But that's where I'm coming from. And with that, I think I should just quit. Don't you think? All right. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sean. This was such a pleasure. What a beautiful, uplifting, positive message. And here's a small token of appreciation from all of us.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks.